Well, welcome. 10 years ago, January 9th, 2007, not very far from here, about 30 miles from here at Moscone Center, something really remarkable happened, which is this.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
So you know about this event, and 232 short days later, and by the way, can we start my timer? That would be awesome. Something really fascinating happened. If you paid attention, you could see this here.
Nokia devices will allow you to touch the screen to navigate. Browsing your content couldn't be easier. Nokia allows you to share all of your content in many different ways. Uploading your photos to Flickr, for example, couldn't be simpler. All these experiences, so elegantly simple. It's what Nokia always has and always will deliver.
I love the end line. Always has and always will deliver. So something clearly went haywire here. And Stephen Elop, the CEO of Nokia, said, we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. And actually, interesting sentence, because you can poke fun at him, but I actually fundamentally believe that there's something really fascinating which happened to his organization, which he was ill-prepared for, and that's what we want to talk about today. It's really this idea of exponential thinking. This is the stuff we're teaching at Singularity University. And what I want to do in the next 29 minutes and 1 second is to give you effectively what we teach in our entrepreneurship and executive program, which takes us about a week. So when you come to our campus, it's a 6-day program, costs you $14,000. We're going to do this in 28 minutes, 44 seconds now, and you get it for free. So brace yourself. It's going to be fast-paced. Let's talk about this notion of exponentials. If you think back to your math class 101, Math 101, an exponential trend looks like this. This is a classic exponential. It's a doubling every time period. It's a compound doubling. When you draw it, it has this hockey stick curve. If you ever pitch a Silicon Valley VC, this is your revenue slide. So the most important exponential trend, and I don't want to bore you all that much with that, is obviously Moore's Law. So Gordon Moore, co-founder and co-inventor of Intel, about 50 years ago, formulated Moore's Law, and this is Gordon.
So I took this doubling every year and extrapolated it 10 years, from 1965 to 1975, from 60 components to 60,000 components on a chip. A pretty wild extrapolation. And it turned out to be ridiculously accurate. One of my colleagues called this Moore's Law. Rather than just being something that chronicles the progress of the industry, it kind of became something that drove the progress of the industry.
So you know all about Moore's Law. It's the reason why the computer in your pocket, your phone, becomes effectively twice as fast every 18 to 24 months. To put this a little bit into perspective, there's a computer called ASCII-Red. It was released in 1997. It's roughly the size of this room here. Cost $55 million US, was commissioned by Sandia National Lab, mostly to do the projections of radioactive fallout after a Third World War, as well as climate projections. So this is 1997. This is relevant because this was the very first computer to break through the 1 teraflop barrier. So teraflop is 1 trillion floating point operations per second, so a goddamn fast computer. $55 million US. 9 years later, you walk into Best Buy, you buy a Sony PlayStation 3, costs you $499, 2.1 teraflops. That is what Moore's Law does to you. So you go from something, the US government simulates World War III, to something your kids now play World War III on a big screen television. Computing goes in 2 interesting directions at the moment. So here's an interesting fact, I believe. Computing bifurcates. So computing goes very, very powerful, like these machines, and computing goes incredibly small. So this is Pi Zero, was released in 2015. It's a full-scale computer. It costs you $5. Has 191 megaflops. You can put a keyboard, a mouse in there, some memory, plug a monitor into it, and you can run Windows on this thing. So $5 gives you effectively the compute power necessary to run a Windows machine. To put this into perspective, for the price of a venti Starbucks latte, this is Silicon Valley pricing, by the way, you now get 2.5 times the compute power of a Cray 1. The Cray 1 was released in the mid-70s, was the most powerful supercomputer at its time, really defined this category of supercomputing. And each of those Cray 1s had more compute power than NASA had total to put the man on the moon. So now for about $5, you get 2.5 times the compute power we had to put the man on the moon. That is, if you believe we put a man on the moon. Different story. It goes super small. This is what is called the Internet of Things. What you're seeing here is, very poignantly, as we are on a golf course, a golf ball. You see the dimple in the golf ball. In that dimple, you see a chip. That chip is 2 millimeters by 1.6 millimeters. Has the raw compute power of an Intel Pentium processor and costs you 75 cents. This chip, and there's many others like it now, is the sole reason why anything and everything which has an electric cord will become smart. There's no question about it, because you get it for free. Every light bulb becomes smart because, again, you will get it for free. This is why Cisco tells you in 3 years there will be 20 billion connected devices on this planet. Now, there's something interesting happening in computing and in IT, and Ray Kurzweil, one of our co-founders, formulated this in what he calls the law of accelerating returns. So effectively, if you believe, and Ray did a lot of research on showing you that the returns we're seeing in Moore's law is actually a trend which is much older. It's about 110 years in the making. If you believe that happens in the future, it extrapolates into the future, and there's no reason to not believe this. You can extrapolate into the future the time when we'll have a computer which has the raw compute power of a human brain, which happens in less than 20 years. So in less than 20 years, there will be a computer, one machine, which has the raw compute power of a human brain. And then we know, Moore's law tells us that we have a doubling every 18 to 24 months. So 2 years later, we've got 2 brains, 4 brains, 8 brains, until about 2050 to 2060, when you will have 7.1 billion or 7.2 billion human brains in one machine. So effectively a machine which is as smart, computationally, as the whole planet. That is to say, and this is the important insight here, that the world you're living in tomorrow will look dramatically different than the world you're living in today. And we'll explore this a little bit further as well. That is also to say that the computer in your pocket will soon be much smarter than you are. So it's a really interesting world we're moving in. Here's the interesting thing. These exponential trends happen in many other industries as well. And this has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of industries are now driven by the gains we get in computing. I'll give you an example, DNA. The cost of DNA sequencing a full human genome, when we did this the very first time was 1999, 7 years effort, part of what is called the Human Genome Project. Cost us $2.7 billion, one genome. So this was a massive breakthrough for mankind. We took a whole human genome and sequenced the whole thing. In 2007, that price dropped to $350,000. A company came out and offered this as a service. 7 years later, the price dropped to $1,000. There's a company called Illumina. They have a machine which looks like a big photocopier, sequences a human genome for $1,000. This is the steepest drop in price we've seen ever in any technology. You go from something nation states can do it, and they do it once, to something your doctor can prescribe it. Now here's the thing. When I work with entrepreneurs, I always teach them 2 questions. The first question is, when you look at price-performance ratios, you always want to ask yourself, where does this go? Right? It's at $1,000 today, but clearly it will get cheaper. So when does it get cheaper, and how much cheaper will it get? And you ask experts, and they will tell you that curve there, that will go down to very close to 0 in the next 5 to 10 years. So in the next 5 to 10 years, sequencing, reading DNA will become effectively free. And then the second question you want to ask yourself is, what do you do with that? Well, I can show you an example. This is one of our entrepreneurs. They're a company called Miraculous. What they're doing is they're taking a blood test, a small subset of your blood, and looking for something called RNA, which is a subset of DNA. Turns out that there's about 12 different types of cancer in your body shed DNA into your bloodstream as they're growing. With this test, which costs less than $200 to administer, they can find reliably cancer in your bloodstream before it turns into stage 1 cancer, including lung cancer. So they're going to, if they're succeeding in their currently preclinical trials, they're going to change the way we do cancer diagnostics. Here's the other way. You will learn this, but the technology has always an interesting dark side. So we're seeing this with cybersecurity, for example. On the DNA side, it's really fascinating what is possible here. This is a friend of mine, Heather Dewey-Hockboard. She has an art project, which I want to show you, and I'll let Heather talk about it.
We don't know yet how our DNA might be used against us in the future.
New York artist Heather Dewey-Hockboard.
One artist in New York is making 3D models of people's faces, people that she's never met.
She calls the project Stranger Visions.
The strangers are people whose genetic material she finds on the sidewalks and subways of New York City.
How much can I actually find out about you from something that you accidentally leave behind?
So just to unpack what Heather is doing here, she's literally picking up cigarette butts from the streets in New York. On the cigarette butt is saliva. That saliva she extracts, which is a technique the FBI is using since like 20 years. If you're watching CSI, you know all about that. She sequences this DNA and then works with a very advanced DNA sequencing lab to reconstruct your facial features out of that DNA. She turns that into a 3D model and then 3D prints these masks. That is, again, to say that the world we are moving into will look dramatically different than the world you're currently living in. Here's another example where these exponential trends hit us really, really hard, despite national governments not seeing it. This is energy. So currently, energy is mostly a carbon-based economy, so we burn coal and oil, etc., with all the problems which come with that. An alternative to that is solar. Now, here's why solar is really interesting. When you look at the cost for solar energy, so you could look at the cost of, for a kilowatt hour to produce a kilowatt hour using photovoltaic cells, that cost has come down since the mid-70s, where it was $80 a kilowatt hour, incredibly expensive. In 2015, here in California, the price dropped unsubsidized to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. That is the same price we're currently paying for coal-based energy. So we have reached what is called parity. The lines are crossing. 2016, Dubai announced that they're building an 800 megawatt solar-powered facility where the internal production price is 3 cents a kilowatt hour. There is no question about this, but solar will rule the world. Like, this price will go down to very close to zero. And you can imagine what like the impact is on the world. Like, how many of the biggest problems in the world are due to us not having enough energy to, for example, desalinate water. There's something called Swanson's law, which says that what you're seeing here is the price of solar dropping and the amount of solar panels installed in the world. For every increase in installments by about 20%, the price in solar halves. So effectively, once you have reached parity, once you've reached the crossing point, there is effectively a race to the bottom. There's now 30 countries in the world where it is cheaper to produce solar than any other form of electricity. Here's why this matters. We're living in a world which we perceive as scarce, where we perceive the resources around us as scarce. And that makes sense because, you know, I grew up with like peak oil happening in the 80s, and then was in the 90s and the 2000s. And we're still talking about peak oil, and eventually we will hit peak oil. If we were to build a solar panel the size of what you see there on your left-hand side, labeled in German Welt, which means world, that solar panel, theoretically, is enough to power the world's energy consumption as it stands today. We're living in a world where energy is absolutely abundant to us. The sun shines so much energy on this planet, we just need to harvest it. We'll come back to this concept of abundance a little later. So here's the challenge. By now, you've learned about these exponential trends, and surely you know a lot about them already. Albert Allen Bartlett, who taught at UC Boulder, once said the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. What he means by that is very, very simple, and here's a very simple example. As we grew up as humans for the last 250,000 years, when we crawled out of our caves, the world, the observable universe, is linear. And it serves us very well to think in linear terms because it allows us to outrun this saber-toothed tiger. It makes it very easy for us to understand linear trends. So take 30 linear steps, one step after the other. How far do you get? You get a good sense, right? It's like 30 meters. You have an intuitive sense how far it is. And again, this made sense in a world where we lived with saber-toothed tigers. Now imagine 30 exponential steps. So every step is twice as far as your last step. So you go from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You do this 30 times. How far do you get? I'm not putting you on the test. Check in with yourself a little bit. I can tell you what I typically hear. There's always someone in the back yelling at me, first answer, a mile. For some reason, a mile. I have no idea why. There you go. Thank you. And then you've got someone in the first row who's, you know, of course they're paying attention, so they're like, no, it must be much bigger. So then they inevitably someone says it's to the moon. And I'm like, okay, that's great. How far is it to the moon? Like, nobody really knows, right? So here's the solution to this. This is 2 to the power of 29. It's a billion meters. It's 25 times around planet Earth. It's to the moon, back from the moon, and halfway to the moon again. This shows you two things. The first is you're incredibly ill-equipped to intuitively understand exponential trends. The second is if you have something which was analog, which moves on a linear curve, and it moves into a digital world and moves on an exponential curve, it goes from 30 to a billion. Now here's the challenge with this. So we've explored technology moves on these exponential curves. Our thinking is linear. In this curve are 3 interesting points. The first point is this. In the beginning, technology, exponentially accelerating technologies move very, very slowly. You're in a phase where you're disappointed by technology. Anyone in this room has played with Google Glass, knows what I'm talking about. I was at Google when we released Google Glass. I was using it for months. And I can tell you disappointment is probably the weakest term I can talk about this product. Because the product is too expensive, battery life is terrible, functionality is pretty mediocre, and you look like an idiot. So what happens is you're disappointed. Now the challenge is when you're disappointed, you're dismissing. Dismissing is the dangerous part because eventually technology gets better and better and better and it crosses the line. This is the moment when Steve Jobs gets on stage and shows you the iPhone, 2007. I was at Apple in Germany when we had a live broadcast of that event. Next to me was a gentleman in a beautiful suit, literally $3,000 suit. And he pulled out his $800 brand new Nokia phone, looks at it, and pardon my language, says shit. Because he understood that a phone doesn't have buttons anymore. A phone is not a phone anymore, a phone is an interconnected computer. And then you get into chaos and amazement. Chaos and amazement is the world where you pop up your head and you actually can't even keep up with the change we're seeing. That's what probably happens currently in computing. The challenge is if you stay on that line, as Nokia did, this is your path to doom. This is where Nokia stayed. Nokia was the iPhone. Nokia had the highest brand recognition in the industry. They had the highest margins in the industry. You couldn't touch Nokia, but they stayed on that line. So be careful. Here's a first insight, and this is very simple. But once a technology becomes digitized, it moves on an exponential curve. Sounds trivial, but it's incredibly powerful. If you find an industry, a technology which is analog, which hasn't been digitized yet, and you can turn it into a digital good, you move it onto an exponential curve. It's the biggest opportunities in your lifetimes. This is the reason why Silicon Valley goes crazy about healthcare, as well as agricultural technology, both industries which are trillions of dollars in total size, and both industries which are largely not digitized. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of frameworks just to give you a bit of a sense of like how do you actually make use of this change. The first one is a descriptive one. It's called the 6 Ds of disruption. This is Peter Diamandis, our co-founder. And I want to explain this to you by using this digital camera as an example. This is the very first digital camera invented by Steven Sasson, who worked at Kodak, the very company which got killed by the digital camera. And here's how this works. In the beginning, you take something and you digitize it. So you take an analog product, film, which is a chemical process, and you turn it into a digital good. The first digital camera had 0.01 megapixels, black and white, took 23 seconds of you sitting still in front of the camera for the camera to capture the image, and the way you looked at the image was you needed to plug the camera into a television set. Which explains why it was deceptive, right? It wasn't a good product. The digital camera moves on a perfect exponential curve. It doubles every time period. So this next iteration of that digital camera already had 0.02 megapixels. Still pretty terrible. 0.04 after a year later, 0.08 after a year later. And year after year after year, the top brass at Kodak told Steven that this is not good enough, and they're really not that interested in the product. Eventually, it becomes disruptive. This is when the lines cross. 2 megapixels. 2 megapixels is good enough to do a 4x6 print or 9x13 if you're in centimeters. This is the time when you stop buying film. This is the time I bought a Canon Digital ELPH, small little camera, $499, last time I bought film. And then eventually you get to these 3. So you start to dematerialize products. A camera is not a camera anymore, but it's a phone. It's about $2 worth of hardware. The rest is software. This is Mark Andreessen's software is eating the world phenomena. You demonetize it, so I'm not buying a camera anymore, I'm not buying film anymore, I don't need to process it. You suck the money out of the system and eventually you democratize it. Now everybody has a camera. There's 3 billion pictures being uploaded to the internet every single day at the moment. Here's a second one. This is probably one of the best books you should read. It's 25 years old. I grew up on this. This was like the Bible when I grew up. I believe this is more important than ever. This is Geoffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, or his theory around crossing the chasm. If you're not familiar with it, it's very simple. The idea is this. As a product matures over time, it hits different markets, different buyers, and they come in different sizes. So you start out with innovators. These are the people, you. There's no real market. Then you sell to early adopters. Early adopters are crazy people like myself. I go on Kickstarter and buy a Pebble smartwatch, unannounced, like unseen. And the reason why I'm, as an early adopter, buy this watch is because I want to be cool, I want to be seen. There's a gazillion reasons for it. I'm also okay if this watch doesn't really work. I'm okay if I need to update the firmware or, like the battery life is terrible. I have particular reasons why I want to have this watch. Then eventually get to early majority. Those are the people who buy this stuff now at Best Buy or on Amazon. They still want to be cool and like trendsetters, but the product needs to work. If you wear an Apple Watch today, you're clearly in the early majority group. Then eventually get to late majority. This is my mom. She sees me with a smartwatch and is like, oh, this is nice, I want one. For her, the thing needs to work. There is no excuse anymore that she needs to charge her watch every day. That doesn't work for her. And then eventually get to laggards. Laggards is my grandma who buys the watch because there's nothing else she can buy anymore. Now, the big insight from Geoffrey was that there's a massive gap, a chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. This is where most Silicon Valley companies go and die, because they never get out of selling to Silicon Valley people and selling to real people in the real world. I give you an example where this is really important, specifically when you're thinking about exponentially accelerating technologies, because these gaps get bigger and bigger and bigger with these technologies, because there's so much on the edge. Here's a simple example. Let me set this up. This is an elderly lady sitting in a Tesla. That Tesla, she's with her son, and that Tesla has autopilot activated, so the self-driving car feature in the Tesla. And see what happens.
I'm scared. Oh, there's cars coming. Oh, there's cars. Ah! Bill, just put me back for me controlling. Oh, dear Jesus. I could never. Oh, where's it going? God damn, Bill. Oh, my God. Oh, this is so scary. Oh, Jesus, this is my first day out and I'm about to die.
Oh, come on, relax.
So let me be super clear about this. Putting your mom into a situation where your mom says to you, I'm about to die, is not cool. Filming it so that I can see it on the internet, absolutely not cool. But the reason why I'm showing you this, beside the fact that it's funny, the chasm stares you into the face. You see the chasm? It's right there. This is, by the way, the reason why I fundamentally believe that the current generation of self-driving cars is doomed. Because of this. And the chasm is this there. It's the steering wheel. The steering wheel moves by itself. It's absolutely eerie. If you ever had that experience, I was at Google when we released Chauffeur, which is the Google self-driving car. I sat in that car. I'm an early adopter. I freaked out. You feel incredibly out of control. So how do you overcome this? There's a couple of ways. How do you cross that chasm? One is, of course, you can go and educate people, right? You can go out and educate them about this thing. Costly, takes a lot of time, very complicated. Or you do something else. You build this thing. This is Google's or Waymo's new car. That car doesn't have a steering wheel anymore. You sit in there, you punch in the address where you want to go on Google Maps, and it just drives. There's no steering wheel, there's no pedals. It's a whole different category. Put people in it, looks like this.
We're like, you said, relax. You don't need to do nothing. It knows when you need to stop. It knows when you need to go.
What she really liked was that it slowed down before it went around a curve and then accelerated in the curve. She's always trying to get me to do it that way.
That's the way I learned in high school drivers.
So as you're thinking about releasing technology, think about how do you overcome that chasm. Again, there's a gazillion ways to do this. This is one. We talked a little bit about this idea of scarcity versus abundance. We talked about this in the case of energy, where we perceive the world as a world of scarcity, whereas in reality we can create a world of abundance. With digitization, this happens in really interesting ways. Take books. Books are a really scarce resource. Like you have to, ultimately grow trees, turn them into paper, print on them. You need to store them. It's a really resource-intensive way. The moment you turn them into a digital good, a lot of stuff happens. Most importantly, the cost of making a copy and the cost of sending that copy to someone goes down to zero, or very, very close to zero, as well as the cost of storing it, which fundamentally shifts business models. So you think about music. Music was an oil-based industry. We bought records and CDs, which were made out of plastic, which ultimately is oil. Along comes Napster. They turn music into MP3s, digital goods, and now I pay $9.99 for Spotify, and I've got 140 million songs in my pocket. You take knowledge. Jimmy Wales comes along and creates Wikipedia. It takes the power away from Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, and gives us all access to knowledge. Here's the important thing about digitization. Because there's factors in digitization, such as the cost of duplication of making a copy and the cost of distribution go down to zero, the business models change. There's a really important piece in here, which is a lot of people think it gets free. I fundamentally believe that's not true. I think what happens is you need to redefine the business models. Here's an interesting one. I spoke to a pharma company, a large pharma company, and we talked about what is a prescription drug. Ultimately, a prescription drug ultimately is purely a formulation of a molecule or a combination of molecules. You can 3D print molecules today. It's incredibly expensive, but you can do it. So in the future, instead of selling me drugs, you just sell me the information. So I talked to them about this, and they were thinking about it, and I said, you know what? Why don't we do a Spotify for prescription drugs? Why don't we do like a $49.99 and you get like all the prescription drugs you need? Think about what this means for piracy. So today I need to buy my drugs over the border and they come, in illegal packages from Canada. Tomorrow I just torrent. It's a really interesting world we're moving in. So think about like as your business turns digital, what this actually means for you. A question I always ask my entrepreneurs is like this notion of like the moonshot thinking. What does 10x look like? Here's an interesting hack. And I'm running a little bit out of time, so I want to make this short. But here's an interesting hack. As an entrepreneur, you typically, if you're fundraising, you typically know exactly how much money you need. And I was a venture capitalist, so people came to me and said, like, we need $1 million, and this is what we use them for. When we liked them, we asked them one simple question. We said, that's fantastic. We give you $10 million. What do you do? I can guarantee you 99.9% of people had no idea. The best 0.1% of people came back to us and said, you know what, that's an interesting question. Let us think about it. They took that question to heart and really rethought, how can we create what we want to create in a 10x manner with 10 times the resources, with 10 times the speed? Came back to us typically with a very, very different business idea, which we then funded. So let's spend the last couple of minutes on this idea is like, why does this actually matter? So technology for the sake of technology is interesting, and we all can talk about this. I can at least talk about this like all day long with you. But really, it's about the big picture. When I was about 25 years old in college, I read this quote from Einstein who said, "We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive." That quote freaked me out. Like literally for a week, I couldn't sleep. I was like, if Einstein has got this perspective on the world, like something is happening. Now, make no mistake, all the interesting indicators go in the right direction. Like the world is getting overall a more peaceful place. Like a lot of the problems we're seeing in the world are moving in the right direction. And yet, I think we have our work cut out for us, and time is running out. So you take something like global warming, where sea levels will rise 2 meters by 2100. This means, by the way, that Manhattan Island is flooded, which means that you need to take, even in Manhattan, just in Manhattan Island, 8 million people who are living on Manhattan Island today need to move. If you want to get an idea what mass displacement looks like, look at the Syrian refugee crisis. That's a mere 1.5 million people on the road. You take the population, there's 9 billion people on this planet by 2050. We currently have enough food, it's just in the wrong places, which is a hard problem to solve. If we want to feed 9 billion people, we need to grow our agricultural output by 2% compound annual. We're currently growing by 1%, so we need to do something. Poverty, there's 3 billion people who live on less than $2.50 a day. I can't buy a cup of coffee in Silicon Valley for less than $2.50 a day, so it's crazy. Sanitation, 2.5 billion people don't have access to proper sanitation, making diarrhea the #1 killer in the world. Water, 800 million people still don't have access to clean drinking water. Illiteracy is a problem which affects still 757 million people on this planet who can't read or write. And malnutrition is a problem which affects us in a way where one child dies every 8 seconds, in a world where in the first world, the abundance of calories is killing us. Here's the thing. I'm an incredibly positive and optimistic person, and I've seen, because I work with entrepreneurs who are solving these really big problems, I know that we can, if we're thinking and acting big, we can solve those problems. The young Steve Jobs made a comment which I want to play for you, which I think is really at the heart of this.
When you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But life, that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand that you can poke life and actually something will, if you push in, something will pop out the other side, that you can change it, you can mold it. That's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. I think that's very important. And however you learn that, once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better, because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
I have the interesting pleasure of working with the US Navy SEALs, and I'm a pacifist, so it makes for really interesting conversation. The US Navy SEALs have a manual which they give to young recruits. In this manual, you'll find on page, 5 or 6, very early in the manual, you find a formula, and that formula is your rate of growth. And what they mean by growth is your personal growth, you as a person. And ultimately, what do you care more about than growing? The reason why you're spending this weekend here in this room when you could be out there playing golf is because you want to grow. Your rate of growth equals the magnitude of the challenge multiplied by the intensity of the attack. If you believe this to be true, and I fundamentally believe this to be true, why wouldn't you pick the hardest problem you can find and attack it as hard as you can? Because that's the way you grow as a person. George Bernard Shaw once said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world, the unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man and woman." If there's a thing I can wish for you, like literally from the bottom of my heart, you have to be unreasonable. We all have to be unreasonable in this world. We're at this really fascinating intersection point of technology. In a lot of ways, I think these are the most exciting, most prosperous times ahead of us, and at the same time, these might be the most scariest and craziest times ahead of us. It is on us to live in these times. It is on you to make those decisions. And one thing I can guarantee you, regardless how you choose, as long as you choose, you're on the right side. Because if you don't choose, the future will happen to you. You become a passive player in this world. You can get all my slides, my contact details, everything on this website. There's also a video version if you want to share it with someone. Thank you so much, and enjoy your stay here.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Wow. Well, I don't know about you, but my mind is blown. So we do have some time for a couple of questions if you'd like to take them.
Of course, yeah.
I'm happy to
always the
see
best
if we
thing.
have questions out there for Pascal.
I think you need to yell because it's
Or if
really
you're just
hard
in
to see.
stunned silence. No, we do have mic runners, so wait for your
Good.
mic runner so you can speak into that. But you might just be stunned like me into amazement. So any questions? I think we might see them in the back. Yeah, just wait a second for a mic so everyone can hear your question. Perfect, thanks. It'll be on just a second.
One really quick question. What are some of the
You
other
can
tactics?
hold it up. Hold it right up.
What are some of the other
There we go.
tactics to overcome the chasm that you mentioned? You mentioned there's some other ways to get that accomplished.
Good question. So education is one, and the classic example is pinch to zoom on the iPhone. So pinch to zoom is a gesture which is like incredibly intuitive to you today. If you give an iPhone to someone who has never ever seen or heard about pinch to zoom, they will never come up with that gesture. So what Apple did was they spent about $10 million in advertising. Literally when you go back to like the early iPhone advertisement, every ad showed you pinch to zoom. When you walked into an Apple store, the first thing they showed you is pinch to zoom. Once you've done it once, it becomes incredibly intuitive. But that's a really interesting example of like educating a market. So sometimes you can educate a market. Sometimes you need to design around the product, as we've seen with the car. Another times you can actually recreate a product category. So I've got a company which does lab-grown meat. So the process to create lab meat in petri dishes effectively. Typically, when I show this to people, like I can literally divide the room into halves. Like there's a half of the room which sits there and like this is great and I would love to, it's cleaner meat and like no animal being harmed. And then half the room basically says I would never eat anything which doesn't have a face. Which fair enough, right? So one of my companies is building products around this, right? They've got this challenge. So what they did is they created new product categories. So they created, for example, a steak chip. It's like a potato chip, but it's made out of steak, artificially grown. There's no such thing as a steak chip, so people don't have a reference point to attach themselves. So I think those are three interesting ways to think about how do you overcome the chasm. Also really recommend reading the book. It's a fantastic, it's a very easy and very relevant book. Easy read and relevant book.
See, I think we have one over there. Yep, right there.
Yeah.
Great.
Hi. My question is, what are the moral ramifications of exponential growth? I mean, are you thinking about that at all?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. I mean, do you think about, would there still be a barrier between good and bad, or everything is relative to something else, and what's that something else?
Right. Wow. Okay. So we think a lot about morals and ethics. So when you come to our executive program, and granted we didn't have the time here today, we dedicate a good chunk of our time with the executives to the questions like how does this future look like, and how do we create a future which is a future we want, and what are the moral and ethical implications? And there's stuff like future of jobs. You've seen the thing about the DNA testing, etc. I choose to believe that people are basically good. It's something I learned at eBay. It's like eBay's mantra. I choose to believe that, on average, the long arc of history bends in the right direction. So I choose to believe that us leveraging technology will be for a greater good of mankind. Should I not believe that, and then sometimes I do these experiments in my head, I get very depressed. I think what happens is the one thing which definitely happens is that the risk-reward pendulum becomes wider, right? We get bigger rewards, but at the same time, we have also bigger risks. Cybersecurity is one where it's like very obvious and observable to us. There's many more in here without a question. So we have to have those discussions. I spent a lot of time discussing these topics with politicians all around the world to talk about regulation around this, rules, ethical, societal norms, etc. It's a really complex topic and needs to be addressed for sure.
I think we have one back there, yeah.
Hi, Gustavo Lemos at XP Analytics. I hope it's not a curveball.
Please.
It goes a little bit off the technological space. So you were talking about microprocessors getting close to zero in terms of cost, and energy as well getting close to zero. What do you think will be the impact on our economical system? Like, capitalism's got to make money out of a marginal cost. So where are we going?
Right. So excellent question. So I think there's two interesting parts in that. The one is the broader question you just posed, which is where are the margins to make profits in? And I think they shift. We see this already. They're shifting. You're shifting from material. You're making less margin in the material good. You're making more margin in, for example, the service industry. Or you're making more margin in brand and brand perception. So I think that is a shift. There's still pieces which are scarce, right? Like a high-end brand, for example, is still a scarce good, whereas the product the high-end brand makes probably isn't. So I think that still is relevant and just shifting. The second really interesting question is particularly when you look at energy. There's a really interesting piece in energy which you can actually read up on. Bloomberg did a long article on this, which is the energy companies in the world currently hold some trillions of dollars worth of reserves in oil fields, natural gas, etc. And they're on the books. So technically, these companies are actually valued against those future gains. Economists around the world think that once the renewable energy paradigm really shifts and we get free solar, etc., we might be in for a crisis which is worse than the housing crisis we had in the US and Europe, because these companies will collapse. So something to think about if you're in the market of shorting stock. Not that I'm a big shorter, but the other thing, by the way, you want to short is Apple. Just saying. I don't think that they have a lot of future in a world where computing gets incredibly powerful, where Apple doesn't play, and computing gets incredibly small and cheap, where Apple doesn't play. So I think it's a fascinating world.
One right here.
Long-term shorting, by the way. Long-term shorting, right? Not short-term.
Take a breath. Take a breath.
I know. Statements from the stage are not need to be evaluated by your financial services providers,
yes, exactly.
and are not an official endorsement.
Just an opinion.
Exactly.
So Otto here from Miami. Quick question. So how do you avoid becoming Nokia, right? So different industries, right? If you're in technology, I think obviously you invest in innovation and whatnot, but some of us folks that are in the food business, right? We're in the restaurant business. Mm-hmm. Are people going to stop eating, right? Do we fear Soylent? Like, what do you do, or at least what are sort of like the steps that an organization should take early on to avoid becoming a Nokia?
Right. So we do a lot of work with particularly large organizations which ask us this question. And I come to believe that ultimately, once a company, and this is true for entrepreneurs as well, I believe, once a company gets to product market fit, the company shifts into effectively a defending the status quo mode, which makes perfect sense, right? Once you get to product market shift, all you want to do is you want to hold on to this as hard as you can. And as your company matures and gets older, the people you bring in are status quo defenders, which is the reason why John Hagel, who teaches at Singularity University, he's at the Deloitte Center of the Edge, as well as I think, what you need to do is if you want to disrupt, you need to disrupt at the edge. So you create these like satellite things at the edge, and they can be like small little companies, they can be little squad teams, whatever works for you. And here's the challenge. So that part a lot of companies get, but then they try to pull that back into the core, and effectively like the antibodies in your organization will kill it. So what you want to do is you want to like create this at the edge and then let this thing grow into its new core, right? There's very few companies which can actually execute this inside the company. Apple under Steve Jobs was a good example because Steve was just such a particular leader, but most companies can't. So in my view, I recommend like just set it up as its own thing and like, let it take over.
Any other? Yep.
Yes. Hi. All the way in the back.
Okay.
Got it.
So a lot of us here, Aslı from Istanbul, a lot of us here are from emerging markets. And sitting from where we are, the things that you're talking about, I think it makes me and maybe some of us feel left behind. And do you think that this is going to make all of us converge, or some people, like the ones who sit in California, are going to, hack their brains and become superhumans and leave the rest of us behind? But do you think that fear is founded, or is it just panic on our part?
So I think there's a bunch of people in Silicon Valley who want to hack their brain and become supercomputers. That's a different story. What I find fascinating is that when you look at something like the power of the smartphone, Apple's iPhone is only 10 years old. I can now go onto a market in Nairobi and buy a phone which is adequate, which is better than Apple's original iPhone for about $20. So what happens is that the gaps the time lags become shorter and shorter and shorter. So I think, like you still have probably like first world epicenters of technology, Silicon Valley being one, surely, Israel, London, etc., probably lead, but the time for emerging economies to catch up becomes significantly smaller. And here's the other thing. You'll have about, 2 billion people coming online, not here, but in emerging markets. And I can guarantee you one thing. Silicon Valley companies, at least from my perspective, my experience, have no idea how to talk to these people. They just don't understand them. So there's massive, massive opportunities as we're closing these gaps. So I don't think you will get left behind. Rather, the time differences get shorter and shorter.
Absolutely. Well, with that, thank you so much, Pascal. I think we all enjoyed that. Thank you. Fantastic.